The fourth speaker is Professor Rob Mackenzie, who is someone who tells me that he was raised in the Hebrides, which is about the most treeless place you could imagine, certainly in the British Isles, and that he's actually a chemist, but he's responsible for an extraordinary world-class project, which he's about to tell you about. He's the Professor of Atmospheric Science and the inaugural director of the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research. And I must say, as somebody who's lived in this part of England for the last 50 years, I was really thrilled when the Forest Research Institute was emerged in Birmingham. It was a bit of a surprise, but nevertheless great to have it as a neighbour. And I visited Rob's research project a couple of times too. So I think it's really timely. Again, one of the things that I've certainly observed in my working life is a shift of emphasis. 35 years ago, all the emphasis was on holes in the ozone layer. That seemed to be the big environmental issue everybody talked about. It's not even on the agenda anymore. I mean, people have forgotten about it. And now carbon absolutely is the flavor of the year or the decade, because obviously of the links to climate change and so on. So to have an international project in England run by somebody of the caliber of Rob is really very special, and I'm sure that you'll find this a very good complement to the very practical and human level of involvement with the air that we breathe and its relationship to green space that you've been hearing about over the last hour or so. So Rob, we really look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Please do shout if you can't see my screen. I think I've shared it correctly.
No, it's working perfectly so far.
And my little pointer, brilliant. So yeah, thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. It's a forum I've very much enjoyed visiting and participating in the past. It's a real pleasure to speak about this work from a facility called Bi4Face. So I'm going to be changing the emphasis a little bit from the human to the forest side, and a little bit from that critical local perspective to the global. And I'm not going to be tying us back to the urban forest, but because frankly that would be really overambitious of me at this point. But I hope that you see that there are links back to the work that we've heard about earlier on today, and in general to do with urban forests. So I'm going to speak about the land carbon sink to begin with, just to get us all on the same page in terms of the rationale for this experiment. Then I'll explain the facility, this Bi4Face facility. So that's the free air carbon enrichment facility of the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research. And it is, I should stress that it's an emerging picture. We're still very much in the early days, seeing how things are shaping up. So I will be finishing with conclusions, but tentative conclusions and some caveats. So let me see if I can, there we go. So the first thing to say about the land carbon sink, or the extra uptake of carbon dioxide into the land vegetation as a result of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is that it is a massive free gift from the Earth system to humanity. Because if that 30% of emissions primarily from fossil fuel use, but also a significant amount from land use change, essentially deforestation, if all of that ended up in the atmosphere, stayed in the atmosphere, we would have already have much stronger global warming, climate change than we do now. So something like a quarter of it is dissolved just through sort of physical chemical process into the top of the ocean. That's a very good thing in itself, and there are interesting things happening in the ocean. And there are also interesting things happening on land. So there's something like between a quarter and a third of the emitted CO2 is taken up into this, what I will call the land carbon sink. Now you might think, I mean, this is essentially enhanced photosynthesis. So you might think, and it would be perfectly reasonable to think, that we would have a really good handle on this. But in fact, this budget in this very simple budget that I've shown you here. In fact, the land carbon sink, the current value of the land carbon sink is the least well-known part of this budget. So even though we've been studying photosynthesis, certainly since the beginning of the scientific revolution, but you could even say all the time since we first started growing crops, this is still rather an unknown quantity, or a poorly known quantity. And in fact, how it will change under climate change is also very uncertain. But first of all, I mean, as far as we can tell, the temperate forest does a lot of hard work. So not all the tropical forests. The tropical forests do an amazing amount of work too. But let's not forget the temperates. So they absorb annually about 3 billion tons of CO2, and that's about equal, but in the opposite direction, to the total amount put into the atmosphere from global deforestation. Or another way of sort of doing that equality is the temperate forest is drawing down from the atmosphere about the same amount as the EU 27 countries are emitting into the atmosphere every year. So it's a really significant part of the story, the temperate forest. And that drawdown is changing, and one would expect it to change as a result of climate change, because essentially its major substrate is CO2. So as CO2 is going up, one might expect the sensitivity to the amount to go up. And indeed it does, but not necessarily proportionately. So there's those of you with a mathematical inclination can think of this as the partial differential of gross productivity. So that's the drawdown, the photosynthesis per unit of carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere. So it's a gradient of productivity, gross productivity, so photosynthesis in gross, per unit carbon dioxide. And that sensitivity is really strong for the deciduous broadleaf forests. So this is a recent paper from Nature where they've looked at this for all the different biomes of the world. And I've just drawn out the temperate forest, because of course I'm making a case here for experiments in the temperate forest. I'm about to show you one. So although the deciduous broadleaf forest is very sensitive, and you can see these other biomes are also sensitive, we also seem to be finding from remote sensing of the Earth, so satellite remote sensing, that this sensitivity is going down over time. So the free gift is becoming less and less over time, proportionately less and less over time. So of course, if that is true, what's going to happen in the future when we go into an even higher carbon dioxide atmosphere is going to change. So it has real implications for our climate management and our management of society. So we need to get a better handle on the processes that are going on, and that's basically what Bioforface exists to do. It's not the first time that people have tried to do these kinds of experiments. So here is a picture of the Oak Ridge free air carbon enrichment facility, which used sweet gum. You can see it's a sweet gum plantation, and that plantation was planted onto an agricultural field. So it was a young plantation on non-forest soil, and that's broadly true of these first generation of FACE experiments. So now we have an interest in looking at more mature forests, and most of the forest in the world is older than 50 years. And we would expect it to react differently to these earlier generation of experiments of young, rapidly growing forests on agricultural land. Because mature plants have different resource priorities. They've already won the race to the light and so on. And crucially, what we're finding is absolutely crucial, is that they have a different coupling to their soil. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in the following slides. So we're interested in doing that similar kind of experiment, looking at the response of a forest ecosystem under elevated carbon dioxide, where it's only the carbon dioxide amount that has changed. So in order to do that, you can't do it in a greenhouse, even if you could build a big enough greenhouse to encapsulate a mature forest, because you would then create a microclimate. So we need to do this out in the open air, and that's what the free air part of this FACE acronym means. You can see in the picture here, there's the ironwork, the plumbing that allows us to do the experiment. And it's all in the open air. There are no walls, there's no lid. So we need to pump carbon dioxide continuously into the patches of, in our case, an oak woodland. It's about 160 years old. The oaks are about 160 years old. The woodland is older than that. And we've got patches where they get elevated carbon dioxide, about 150 parts per million of CO2 extra, so 150 units above the 405 that we're at globally as an average at the moment. So that's taking us, that's basically dropping these patches into the atmosphere, the atmospheric composition of the mid-century, 2050, 2060, something like that. Now, we're not changing the temperature, we're not changing precipitation patterns, relative humidity, those kind of things. To do that, we would have to have 3 or 4 times the size of the facility that we've got currently. And we've already got the world's biggest climate change experiment. So it just, we couldn't do it much as we would have liked to. There are only 2 other facilities of this scale on the planet. One looks very similar to this. It's just outside Sydney in a Mediterranean setting. So Sydney, Australia, Mediterranean climate. And then the other one is based on enclosed pieces of bogland in Minnesota, but is also a giant piece of kit. So we've got 3 patches that have got this elevated CO2, this future atmosphere, and then we've got 3 patches that just get the ambient air blown at them. So even the infrastructure and the process of delivering the added CO2 has been reproduced in our control patches. We started making measurements in 2015, 2016. The CO2 was switched on in April 2017, and it's going to run all the way through to the end of the growing season in 2026. Unless someone's got a few million quid to keep us going beyond that, which I would be very grateful for, and please get in touch if you do. The CO2 is added during the day, so from just before sun up to just after sundown, just during the growing season, because we don't want to just go spraying CO2 into the atmosphere for no reason. We only want to put it there when the plants can utilize it. And this is what it looks like from above. The patches that are getting the extra CO2 are here and here and here, and then there are 3 control patches, one here, and one behind this little graph here. And the graph really is just to convince you that in fact this does work. So these are the elevated CO2 patches sitting each growing season sitting at about 550 parts per million, and then these are the control patches sitting at the ambient level with the seasonal cycle. You can even see the seasonal cycle inside that. So it really does work. We really are dosing just CO2 into this experiment. What do we see? Well, starting at the top, we see increased photosynthesis. You give plants extra CO2, they are very well adapted evolutionarily to make use of that CO2. So as long as there's enough light, so this is quite a complicated schematic here, sorry, but the bit that's of particular interest is at the top here where you've got plenty of light, and what we're seeing there is an enhancement. So 1, on where you can see my pointer now, this level 1 here would mean that the treatment and the control are photosynthesizing exactly the same. And what we see is about, at the strongest light levels, about a 30% increase in photosynthesis under elevated CO2. If you take into account all the light conditions, because it doesn't always, the sun does not always shine on Wolverhampton, regardless of what Chris might tell you. The average over all light conditions is around 23% enhancement. Now, one of the strongest signals that we saw very promptly, along with that enhancement in photosynthesis, was an enhancement in respiration from the soil. So the release of CO2 also goes up under elevated CO2. It's like you're really pushing carbon through the system much faster. And that's what this graph shows here. So the blue dots are the elevated CO2 showing during the growing season, you have an extra respiration from the soil, and then it relaxes back to the same level as the ambient during the winter, and then comes out again in the summer. And I just draw your attention also to the fact that the years, the growing seasons, are quite different. I'll come back to that right at the very end. And then just summarising those up in those bar charts here on the bottom right. And it's about a 20% increase in soil respiration. Right, now, soil respiration. It's not the soil that's respiring. It's everything that's alive in the soil that is respiring. So that is, of course, the plants themselves. So to maintain their roots and to grow roots, they have to expend energy. And just as I'm doing now, I'm expending energy with this talk. They will be respiring and releasing CO2. So there's the autotrophic respiration from the plants. And then there's everything that's eating the plants and eating the things that eat the plants. So microbes, invertebrates, everything that is alive and feeding off that bottom of the food web will itself be changing the energy store of the sugar that was produced by photosynthesis into back into CO2. So that's what's happening here. But it's not just like a free wheel. We are seeing the forest building itself with this extra resource. So there's a strongly enhanced production of fine roots, especially in the O horizon. That's the bit at the top, I've now learned since I've become a soil scientist. The bit at the very, very organic rich, detritus rich, litter rich bit at the top of the soil horizon, the O horizon. So the fine roots are very strongly enhanced in that area. That's the orange bars here. The green and the blue bars are the ambient controls with the infrastructure, and then the green ones are undisturbed patches that we don't have infrastructure in. It's not quite so strongly enhanced lower down in the soil core. That's what the two lower graphs show, but there's some indication that there might be something going on. And you can see this is growing season 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021. And one thing I should say is that because of really brilliant technical and research staff, we were able to continue some baseline measurements, well, not baseline, but core measurements through 2020, through the pandemic, which was absolutely an astonishing effort on behalf of the team. And I really thank them for that. It's not just the plants that are benefiting from the drawdown of carbon. There's also strongly enhanced microbial carbon. Again, most strongly enhanced in that O horizon. So the microbes are benefiting indirectly from the carbon that's being captured by increased photosynthesis and then being passed on to the microbes below ground. So I hope you're beginning to get that sense of a really deeply, intricately connected system. And so just to get to conclusions and caveats, to give you some broad sense of what we've seen. I can't go into all the details of what we've seen, but just to summarize that we've got a carbon cycle here in green, where we're seeing increased photosynthesis, increased stem growth. I haven't mentioned that, but that, that is something we've seen. Increased fine root production, I said something about that. Increased respiration. We're also seeing an increase in exudates. These are the dissolved organic, mostly sugars and amino acids that come out of the roots to get the soil microbial community working. So it's basically a power source for the soil microbial community. And that's going up under elevated CO2. So some of the CO2 the plant is using for itself, some it seems to be they seem to be using to prime the rest of the community. Then we've got changes in the nitrogen cycle in red, which I won't detail in all the pieces. We're also looking at the phosphorus cycle. We haven't seen any changes in that yet. And we're also looking at the water cycle. And we've got some tentative signals in the water cycle. We might expect there to be some signals because carbon and water are very closely related in forests. But at the moment, we're not seeing anything that's coming straight out of the variability. And mention of variability takes me to my last substantive slide here, which is really just looking at the greenness of the canopy. So that's what the green trace is here. It's just a red, green, blue camera looking down on the forest. How green, so how much of the light is green as a fraction of the total light coming into the camera. That's what this trace means. And so it gets very low in the winter as the canopy loses its leaves and becomes brown. And then this is the typical springtime peak of very fresh, very green leaves. And then we see the summertime greenness and then the drop in autumn. That was 2017. That's a very typical year. 2016 was similar. I've just copied that orange trace out to 2018, 2019, and 2020, just to draw your attention to the fact that 2018 and 2019 look really very different. And they were very different because of a combination of climatic factors. So 2018, there was only 640 millimeters of rain in that year compared to 872 the year before. And 872 is much more like a typical value for this location. So it was dry, but we also had an insect outbreak, possibly not unconnected. So there was a moth outbreak which defoliated the canopy, and the canopy did recover, but it didn't ever get back to where it was in 2017. And that happened again in 2019. 2020 looked much more like a standard year. So we're going to see differences from year to year, and that's why we need to make at least a decadal experiment so that we can start to see the pattern amongst the annual variability. But although the soil respiration, for instance, was very different in those 2 years, the treatment effect, so the difference between elevated CO2 and ambient, was retained. And similarly for fine root production. The absolute values are very different, but the treatment effect was maintained. And I should just finish by saying thank you very much to the loads and loads of people whose data, some of whom whose data I've shown. There's lots more data in the background I haven't had time to show you. There are lots and lots of people from Birmingham, but also from an international network of collaborators who are really helping us get to grips with this complicated story of what happens to forests under elevated carbon dioxide. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand back to Chris.
Thank you very much, Bob. Exciting, as I knew it would be. I'm just waiting for the, there we are. It's a slight time lag. I'm always excited by the scale of what you're doing there. The idea that you might be able to create big enough structure to capture a whole chunk of forest. I had a question for you while the other speakers are just getting themselves organized and their cameras and microphones on, about the soil side of what you're doing, because one of the striking things about the urban forest, I guess, is that very often the trees are growing in a setting where there is very little evidence of the soil. Either you've got concrete and paving, in the case of street trees, or you've got close mown grass and leaf litter is removed and so on. And I just wondered what your view was about how we might change the urban forest to make rather more of its capacity to absorb carbon particularly, and also what the relationship might be between the experiments that you're doing in this rural context and those very different kind of physical circumstances.
Yeah, you're tempting me to to step onto shaky ground and maybe overextend my my limited knowledge. But I mean, I completely understand where you're coming from. I think you're absolutely right that the coupling between above ground and below ground and between plant and soil is radically different in a lot of the urban forest. I mean, I think there are, you know, the parkland and pockets of relic forest in urban areas where that coupling is more like what you can see here. I would absolutely love to get a stronger handle on how much of the cycling that we're able to observe in this forest can even happen inside in urban contexts of different kinds. Certainly, if you're going to take away the ephemeral carbon, the deciduous leaf, the leaf litter, then you are radically changing the carbon storage ability of forests, because you're essentially taking away one of the key drivers of soil building. And if you don't allow the soil to build, you won't get that really long-term storage of carbon, much longer than a tree.
Yeah.
So when you start thinking about where the carbon is that really has a long time life away from the atmosphere, it's not the trees, it's actually what they call the recalcitrant carbon in the soil.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think it's really interesting how much more of a conversation there now is about that. I mean, both in the marine environment, where blue carbon is suddenly an agenda item, and in agriculture, where there's a realization that, you know, cultivated agricultural land is releasing carbon and permanent pasture can accumulate it. So it's just a great moment, I think, for your kind of work to be linked in with what is a very much broader conversation. Anyway, there are questions, I'm pleased to say, for the other two. And I know, Rob, you've said if there are questions that are aimed at James, then you'll have a go at them. For a question for Dominic from Rick, are landowners and land managers being paid for the use of their sites for Green Gym?
No. That's the short answer. I can give you a longer answer. I'm not sure, and whether Rick can elaborate on. I wonder why he was asking the question, because I think there is some discussion. Certainly, we come across with landowners like parks, for example, having people using commercial activities on their land and not being paid for that. You know, the landowner not getting any recompense for that. I would say in terms of our programs, it's a slightly different model. I mean, normally it's the other way around, like landowners are wanting us to come onto their land because they want to deliver health and wellbeing benefits, either explicitly because of a particular funding program or because of their wider sort of approach. So again, a bit like Claire was talking about with all the different sites, lots of the landowners want to deliver those health benefits. So in some cases, the landowners are actually paying TCV to deliver the program, either because they want those health and wellbeing benefits, or because they want to ultimately set up sort of self-sustaining groups who then have a role in managing whether it's woodland or community gardens or whatever the site might be. So no, it actually works almost the other way around from what we were suggesting, that they pay us. Very often it's not them directly, very often it's a partnership. So we'll look together to sort of secure funding, dependent on what the focus is and what the site is and stuff like that.
Good, thank you. And Claire, a question about the kind of landscapes that that people are making use of. Is there a preference amongst people for open spaces and woodland, and as opposed to woodland? And I kind of caveat by saying that I know enough about the work that you do and the Green Gym to know that a sense of security for those participating is absolutely central to the success, isn't it? It's almost the prime role that the leadership plays in giving people the confidence to actually go out into those landscapes. So I just wonder whether you're seeing that, Claire, reflected in the kinds of landscapes that are preferred.
You took the words right out of my mouth, Chris. So yes, it is about the work that we're doing is connecting people who don't normally have a natural affinity to getting their maps out and going tramping through the great outdoors. This is about encouraging people who are the most needed to make tiny baby steps, if you like, to connect with nature. these are the people that we're really trying to work with. And in doing so, I said before, we take away all the barriers. So we take away, you know, the barriers of having to have transport and so on. So some of the projects are in the local park, and that's really important because they feel that they know where they're going. And that's really important for some people. I mean, I've had people come to one of our schemes and they sit in the car for half an hour before they have the courage to get out of the car, and often need someone to come with them. Likewise, there are loos and there's a community cafe at this place. So it's one of our places for the most vulnerable people. However, when we're doing bushcraft, screen gym, then we start to work in an area that's a little bit more wooded. And no, nothing makes me happier as a community forester to when we're delivering the Natural Health Service in the community woodlands. I mean, that's sort of part of our DNA, but I know it's not for everybody, and it is about making people feel confident and feel safe that they can then take the next step. And I think that's what I was talking before about during lockdown. People have appreciated new woodlands, and we're hoping that by showing them what happens in some of the parks of woodlands, then they feel confident enough to be able to explore further afield.
I think we've all noticed what an extraordinary change there's been in parks and local green spaces through the last 12 months. Certainly my local park is absolutely heaving because it's the only choice. You know, people can't go off into the wider countryside at the moment. And I'm hoping that that is introducing a lot of people to a park they didn't know before, and that once they've seen it and felt safe there, they'll go back. But I'm certainly also seeing some local authorities beginning to make the connection between the health benefits and accessibility. And in Wolverhampton, where I live, we have a fantastic resource of canals, and the canal towpaths have been a no-go area, really, because they've not been the responsibility of the local authority. But now, really, as a result of the pandemic and people discovering them, there is now real political pressure to actually make them more accessible, take them more seriously, signpost them. And there's a question from Alan, who's convening tomorrow's session, about how we make the common sense and the science that we've been hearing about resonate with the politicians that have to make the decisions and make the investment. And I just wonder whether any of you would like to chip in and either give us examples of the persuasiveness that you've seen working with politicians, or what you perceive to be the barriers to that kind of great leap forward when suddenly the politicians see the value and the need for investment. Anybody fancy a go?
I've got fantastic experience within Cheshire West. So Cheshire West is the local authority, and it's unusual that, you know, both sides of the political spectrum are really supportive. So at the moment, the Labour Party is in power, and the leader of the council actually is one of the biggest advocates of the Natural Health Service, but equally so is the leader of the opposition. So it's a really great. They both come from quite different, but really understand the benefits that we get. So I cannot speak high enough of the political support within Cheshire West from both sides, and to say that actually a lot of the funding that we've got is coming through from public health, and they've been really supportive of the work. So that's a really nice story. And I have to say, you know, Purdah and all the rest of it. So I'm in England, I should say that we've got elections tomorrow, so we have to be really careful in order to ensure political balance.
Don't worry, nobody's listening to us, Claire.
I just want to say that from both sides of the political spectrum, it has been very well supported. I think that's, I think I'll stop now.
Thank you. And Rob, what about nationally? I mean, are you finding it's possible to actually engage the attention of government ministers and policymakers? Do they even know where rural Staffordshire is, for instance?
I did have a chief scientist who said Britain doesn't do forests, does it? Which was a bit disheartening. But that person has moved on now, and actually I would say that there's a lot of openness to to these discussions and to the broader political agenda. Sometimes it's a little bit about making things concrete, I think, and that's why I'm so impressed by the work I've heard earlier on today, because that, you know, it gets sometimes, especially in the kind of areas I'm working in, the academic areas, it can all get a little bit too broad and airy-fairy, and it's so good when you actually see it implanted. I think governments are taking this seriously now, and they're putting money where their mouth is. Although I see that Cecil has put a question around funding for face facilities in the Q&A, and I might just take the opportunity to answer it now. Thanks.
Yes, please do.
I think we've just been a bit slow off the mark in making the case to the politicians. I think we're getting there now, as the politicians realise that net zero has some really serious implications for carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. So that's one of the things that's really focusing. But also, I think the community itself, not this community, but the forest community much more broadly, has not always spoken with a single voice in the way that perhaps the oceanography community have, or the ice community have, and I think that's been to its detriment, if I might say so.
I think also that one of the things that's significant in the UK is that we are hosting the COP26, the climate change event in Glasgow, assuming it still happens, and that is suddenly starting to be quite politically significant. I think captains of industry and ministers and others are suddenly realizing that they're going to have to be able to say something in October or November, and they've never really thought about it until now. And so certainly, I mean, the targets that are being set by industry are absolutely extraordinary, and it's partly driven by that. Now, I work with the National Grid, for instance, the electricity distribution company, quite a lot. They're one of the 5 key sponsors of the Glasgow event, and that's certainly concentrating their minds on what their chief executive is actually going to be able to stand up and say about climate change and carbon in only 6 or 7 months' time. So I think we're quite lucky, I think, in that opportunity is driving the politicians quite a lot. Dominic, anything to add?
I was just going to add that, well, I think it comes on the back of Rob's point quite neatly, because I was going to say, I think one of the key things is that speaking with one voice, I think, which, never mind about forestry, like I think the whole green sector doesn't do very effectively, because I think that the challenge is that I'm not sure that there's many people who don't get it in principle, whether that's in government or local government or anywhere else, but the problem is that there's quite a big structural problem underlying that. So like, if you've got all these different benefits coming from one program, that sounds like that should be fantastic, but actually it's a disaster when it comes to funding, or it makes it very difficult when it comes to funding anyway, because often the funders are looking at one individual purpose, and that goes for whether it's government funding or trusts and grants or whatever. So I think it's trying, and then we do very easily get siloed into, oh, well, we do health, or we do community, or we do trees, or we do atmospherics, or whatever it might be, and that's why, you know, things like this are very good, because we've got people talking from very different angles, but actually the things that are common are common, and I think the more we can make that, like Rob was saying, that simple point, but also that beyond that simple point there has to be a funding mechanism that follows that, and you know, that has to go through to local councils and stuff, because I'd say the same as Claire said, I don't find any lack of will, but there is often very difficult, well, just a lack of funding, but also just a difficulty in the structure of the funding, which doesn't really allow these multiple benefit things to be easily funded.
Yep, I was thinking about that in watching James's presentation at the beginning of the session, and you remember that he was close to the end. He was talking about the idea of closing 2 lanes of a 6-lane urban highway in order to plant green hedges, in order to create a cleaner air zone for pedestrians and cyclists, segregated from and protected from the air pollution generated by traffic. All of that really clear, absolutely logical. Who could argue with it? Until you realize how many different bits of the system you would have to get lined up to even have the conversation. And I'm sure a lot of us have spent enough time beating our head against tree trunks in the highway with highway engineers who see them only as obstacles and accidents waiting to happen. And the idea that they might begin to take them seriously as an aid to reducing the impact of traffic on air quality is a long way down the line. Which is why I think you're quite right. These kinds of events are important because apart from anything else, I hope what they do is empower people. They give you the arguments again. They remind you very often of stuff that you've kind of almost given up arguing because you've done it so many times. And it's just reassuring. I hope it's reassuring to know that you are a part of a community of interest and that there is research and it's not just you, and that other people have found ways of, as Claire was saying, of actually reaching the politicians or possibly even reaching the highway engineers, and that the more we hear from one another about the good and the bad examples, I think the more empowering it is. And that, to some extent, has, I think, been the secret of the European Forum for Urban Forestry for the last, well, 20 odd years. That apart from the social side and the singing, which is an acquired taste, I think, which some of you may one day get to experience if we ever get together again. I'm not suggesting that we all combine forces on our screens and sing in the way that the EFUF gatherings often do it after the last dinner. But certainly, I think that that coming together of passion very often and enthusiasm with real in-depth practical knowledge and this addition of the research that you've experienced this afternoon is very powerful, and we just have to make sure that it continues in one form or another. So can I just thank well, the four speakers, 3 and 1, for their contributions today, and hand back to Clive with that kind of congratulations from me that you and your colleagues have managed to sustain the impetus. In many ways, I think this event is, I hesitate to say, an improvement on the original, but actually certainly it's not something which I would see as a kind of a second best and a failure. I think it's been a terrific challenge, but you've met the challenge, and I hope everyone will agree that the quality of what you've managed to pull together between you, certainly today, has been absolutely terrific. So Clive, over to you to wind up.
Well, a big thank you from me as well to all the speakers this afternoon, including the video speaker, James, earlier on, and Chris also for your expertise in moderating, which for me has been a brilliant session. I can only echo your words that I think this is far from a second best experience of EFUF. And whilst we don't have the benefit of networking so easily this year, in terms of the content, that is really good. I can see that probably as way of a hint that I have now been pushed off the main screen, and that the promotion for the My EFUF app is there. I would encourage people very much to download that application to their phone. It's the shop window that we have created this year, and gives directions to all of the activities that are still to take place. I mean, EFUF is not finished. The semester will continue. I'd also like to say that we do hope that in addition to the online activities, which will now be a rolling program throughout the year, that we do hope that there will be a present in-person forum next May 2022 in Belgrade in Serbia. So I would invite you, for those that are interested in that, to be able to already put some dates in the diary. So finally, let me say that tomorrow the forum continues. We have trees and urban design. The moderator tomorrow is Alan Simpson, recently retired from his university position in Leeds. Alan's a long-standing supporter, as is Chris, of EFUF, and the theme tomorrow, trees, urban design, day 3 of this Urban Forestry for a Resilient Future conference. Thank you very much and good afternoon.